Today's presentation will be given by Rebecca Nedostup, who's an associate professor of history at Brown University. She's the author of Superstitious Regimes, Religion and the Politics of Chinese Modernity, which was published by Harvard Asia Center in 2009. And this book is an excellent and thoroughgoing study of the fate of religion in modern China that examines the transformation of religious practice and conceptions of religion under nationalist rule through a meticulous study of local practices. She convincingly demonstrates that the rituals at the heart of the modern nation state, the nationalist, secularist, affective regime, never fully succeed in replacing religion in actual practice. She has since published several other pieces on the relationship between religion and politics in modern China, most recently, Finding Nature in Religion, Hunting Religion from the Environment, which is in Religious Diversity and Ecological Sustainability in China. Her current work, on which she'll speak today, focuses on displacement, community formation, and the agency of the dead. Professor Nedostup is a co-organizer and co-editor of the ongoing project entitled The Social Lives of Dead Bodies in Modern China, and this year she's a fellow at the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University, where she's writing Living and Dying in the Long War, Tales of Displacement in China and Taiwan, 1937 to 1959. The title of her talk today is Experiencing Long War in Mid-20th Century China and Taiwan. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much for coming out today. Thank you very much to Kyle for inviting me here. And thank you to Ina for the wonderful reception and helping me get here after a few tries this weekend. I finally made it. United willing. So what I'd like to do today is to give you some examples from this book that I'm writing, and by doing so, make a few suggestions for some ways in which we might think about the 20th century, the kind of long 20th century experience in Chinese societies, in some ways that are familiar, I think, but maybe set aside, and some ways that might be a little bit new. So at its most elemental, what I want to bring forth is two ideas for discussion, and I really think that these can only be examined as part of a collective effort. The first is the idea that the long-term effects of military mobilization and action on the civilian populations of China and Taiwan is a topic that deserves scholarly attention. I'm certainly not alone in this. Rana Mitter's book, Forgotten Ally, has been an important work in this regard, and it's garnered a lot of popular attention, both in the English-speaking world, but in the Chinese-speaking world as well. It has translated into Chinese almost immediately. It's all over the bookstores in China and Taiwan and Hong Kong. So it's really remarkable in that we have much, much further to go, I think. The second point is that in order to accomplish this, I think it's often helpful as an intellectual exercise, but also as a matter of research strategy, that we experiment with periodizations that push beyond the boundaries of conflicts as determined by nation states, treaty signatories, regional armies, or other quote-unquote official combatants. Since the participants, whether they be human, animal, environmental, Michael Muscolino's new work on the environmental effects of the Second World War is what makes me think of that. Since the participants in 20th century history often experience multiple conflicts, considering discrete encounters, whether they be the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, the Cold War, or earlier militarist or so-called warlord wars, considering any of these in isolation, however felicitous to the researcher, and I say this with some sense of the practicalities of doing this, and however necessary as a stepping stone, runs the danger of obscuring important through lines of human experience. To take a step back and consider a bigger picture, on the other hand, of course, poses risks as well, and maybe those risks will become apparent to you in the next 40 minutes or so. But what I want to do is to take a few disparate examples and try to lime a hole and to begin to analyze and theorize them more extensively than they have been done in the modern China field, which really has been driven by questions of revolution and modernity, I would say, in the past several decades, more than questions of the role of mass violence in everyday life. So to begin that, let's turn to some videotape. And the example that I want to start with is an event that was recently had an important anniversary, the 60th anniversary of it. And I think depending on your interests and, dare I say, age, you may or may not be aware of this anniversary and the event. So here's a newsreel.
The Taichen Islands, 200 miles northwest of Formosa, have been evacuated and left for occupation by China's Red Army. These pictures of the operation have just reached this country. GIs and nationalist Chinese troops worked together to clear the islands. The garrison of 14,000 and every item of their equipment had to be moved. Nothing of value was to be left. Then, in silence, the people of the islands moved to the waiting boats. There were 18,000 of them. Bewildered, unable to grasp the reasons why they should leave their homes, they filed down to the beaches. It was a scene all too familiar in this half-century. We saw it recently in Korea. Before that, in almost every country in Europe. Earlier still in Spain and Abyssinia. Men, women and children on the run. Their only crime, that they had made their homes in the path of the machine of war. Operation Pullout, a code name that covered one of the most tense military moves of recent times. With orders to shoot only if shot at, the Americans carried out the operation, never knowing if or when the Reds might attack. Quickly the islands were cleared, and the people huddled near the beach waiting to board the boats. Their homes had been destroyed by now. There was no turning back. Just off the Taichens, guard was kept by ships of the United States 7th Fleet. Landing craft left their parent ships and hurried towards the beaches to pick up the evacuees and take them to Formosa. Soon they must set about building new homes and making a new life for themselves on Formosa. But there too they will find no peace, for the island is under constant threat of invasion by the Chinese communists, and it is from Formosa that Chiang Kaishek hopes to launch an attack on the mainland of China. History may recall the Formosa crisis by debating the rights and wrongs of Chiang Kaishek and Mao Zedong. But perhaps it is within these scenes that the truth is to be found. Perhaps indeed the truth of all war. Lives twisted by its course, or ended by its outcome.
So on that very dramatic note, let me turn to some of the things that this moment and this film suggests. So in this very overheated narration, we can hear at least two narratives, I think, about this event. And the event is the evacuation of the Dachan Islands off of the coast of Zhejiang to Taiwan, the evacuation of the civilian population, which happened just a little over 60 years ago at the beginning of February 1955. There's a handout, by the way, that has some of these details, if you're interested. So this was the culmination of the first Taiwan Strait crisis. And so one of the narratives, of course, the most obvious one that you can hear is the narrative of the Cold War, of course, the one that's much more familiar to us. So we hear the narrative of, in a way, of revolution and counter-revolution. And that narrative and its critique is a very comfortable one for us in modern Chinese studies, I think. But there's a second one that the narrator himself engages in, and that points to a longer recurring historical narrative of the experience of war. And so, of course, the way it's put forth by British Pathé is considerably more dramatized and than might make us comfortable these days. And some of it is, in fact, insidious. There are implications about the perpetual suffering of the Chinese people and the way that these images mix together with ones that have come down over the course of the 20th century, has some resonance over the sorts of visual depictions of Chinese suffering to which the world would have been exposed for 2 decades. And in some arenas, of course, for quite a bit longer, particularly starting with the 19th century. Yet I would say, and that's something this we can certainly talk about and analyze, but I want to set that aside for a moment and pick out something. Amid that, the narrator tells us of people, quote, bewildered, unable to grasp why they should have to leave their homes. And I would suggest that in casting our eyes over the experience of the long 20th century in Chinese societies, we might look for that experience recurring and try to analyze its social affects in more detail. So we might profit from attending not only to continual refinements of the revolutionary narrative, but more to the effects of mass violence. And the Dacheng story suggests a few things, and I'm going to use it to illuminate a little bit more about recurring narratives that happen from the 1930s through the 1940s and 1950s. So what happens with Dacheng is, in a way, it allows an experience of displacement to be spoken in Taiwan that was not spoken to that point. So here you can see the physical location of the islands themselves, just to get a sense if you're not familiar where they are. So when between 17 and 18,000 civilians are brought, and this is following the very famous Battle of Yijiangshan, in which guerrilla warfare was engaged, and some 700 out of 1,000 nationalist forces were killed. The evacuation, of course, was affected by the U.S. 7th Fleet as well as nationalist naval forces. But when they were brought to Taiwan, a few things happened. First of all, the people of Dacheng had to be integrated into the Republic of China before they could be brought physically into the Republic of China as it existed on Taiwan. These offshore islands were not very closely governed. So there was a process, a sort of sped up process that happened in Dacheng that actually many refugees, wartime refugees in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War and then the Civil War also had to go through, which is registration, sometimes either registration as refugees in the case of people from Dacheng, also registration as citizens of the Republic of China, and political education. You can see here a slogan honoring, valorizing Chiang Kaishek on the wall. They were given identification cards as citizens. And so this was all happening in very quick succession in the year or so, a little more than a year leading up to the evacuation. The evacuation itself was a sort of a very refined example, a notable example of another typical experience of the mid-century refugee, which is optics. This was recorded, it was exported for view around the world and meant to teach lessons. Whether sometimes these are philanthropic lessons, but this is also a political lesson. So there were photographers, of course, from the Republic of China, but there were photographers from the United States as well. So these are refugees on U.S. 7th Fleet ships landing at the port of Geelong in Taiwan. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, of course, made herself very visible, handing out food to the arriving Dachenese. And the cover, or my cover image, also showing the infrastructure of nursing, healthcare, education. And this is all gradually within Taiwan. It's sending a message, actually drawing a social, educational, cultural distinction between what the Republic of China had set up on Taiwan and what the Dachanese were like, implying that even visually, sending visually the message that the Dachanese are not only pitiful and needing help, but of course that they are poorer, that they have a lower level of culture and education and so on. But the world press was there as well. And we can find many instances from world press agencies and in magazines such as Life noting the evacuation. And this particular one was very important for the Cold War effort. Also, American soldiers who were involved in the Dachan evacuation themselves took photos and memorabilia. You can find these all over the web now. So this was a notable moment for them, sort of sandwiched in between the Korean conflict and the conflict in Southeast Asia, a moment where they thought they were doing good, sort of unequivocally doing good compared to those other conflicts. The PRC also saw this as an event which they wanted to say something about to the world. So there's a Red Cross publication coming out of Beijing, printed in Chinese and English, describing this event as a human rights disaster enacted by the nationalists. And here's of the few people who were left behind, very few people left behind, were interviewed and made to decry the property damage that was done by the nationalists. And of course, the nationalists destroyed a lot of the buildings, some of them armed fortifications, but some of them houses as well as they left, hoping not to leave nothing to the communists as they took over the islands. So this was a PR war. But is also a moment in which the Dachanese have themselves, of course, their own multiple narratives about this, and there are a number of scholars in Taiwan who have been working on this. But the Dachanese are used as a symbol for a Taiwanese conversation about displacement, which had really not happened up until that point. And to describe that conversation, I want to turn to a play that came out shortly after the evacuation. There was a fair amount of sort of material about the evacuation that was created for internal consumption within Taiwan. And one of these was a play by a man named Gao Qian, who later became a writer for television in Taiwan in its infancy in the 1970s, but was well known as a playwright later in the 50s. So it's called Farewell Dachan, 再会吧 Dachan. It's actually that way. Sometimes it's not a mistake. And so this play, it's a very interesting play and 5 acts, and it centers around this family who in a lot of ways resembles your kind of like standard new culture era family, like conservative parents, children who want to go off and join the army or join the revolution and are trying to convince the parents to drop their old ways. And one of the daughters actually goes off and joins the guerrilla forces, fighting for the nationalists against the communists, and she disappears. And so there's this scene is, this excerpt is from a climactic scene where the other children are trying to convince the family to leave, trying to convince their parents to evacuate. And the parents don't want to do it, and they say things like, Dachan, we've been here for generations. And first they talk about property, right? The father says our land is here. The mother says our bar, our shop, what about our house? But then they start to talk about something a little bit different. The father says, Dachan has the property given to us by our ancestors. It has our lineage tombs. We can't leave those behind. Then the mother says, we haven't found your sister's body yet. We can't go without your sister. We can't go without, essentially implying we can't go without burying it properly. We'd be doing her wrong. And then one of the children, so there's this, everybody's crying. Then one of the younger daughters makes this very patriotic speech which says, essentially, it doesn't matter how sad you are, Chiang Kaishek is sadder. Who wants to leave, who wants to leave home? But I believe that the government suffers unfathomably, and that the president's heart is certainly heavier than ours. But they found a way for us. They're going to bring us to Taiwan. And notably, also says, we're only leaving for now. We're going to come back someday. We're going to fight our way back. This play was not performed for Dacheng people. This play was performed for Kuomintang military, for troops already on Taiwan who had been there since 49, or maybe even earlier, since 47. So what does it mean to have this discussion? To have people talk, have the Dachenese voice ventriloquize this experience of saying, it's okay that we left. It's okay that you left your home. It's okay that you left your dead relatives. It's okay that you left the tombs behind. We're here for a reason. We'll fight our way back. This was something that those troops had not been allowed to express publicly. But the arrival of the Dachenese gives an opening for this discussion about being displaced, being a refugee. The nationalists do not call themselves refugees. They do not call themselves displaced. The Nationalist Army does not call itself refugee. But the Dachenese are allowed to be put in that position. So they allow this triangulation, which opens up a discussion about what it means to be a refugee. So this example of what the Dacheng experience comes at the end point of this book that I'm writing that really talks about the experience, the long-term experience of being displaced. Again, sometimes in terms of individual people, again and again, during the war, and starting off with people who are displaced from East China to Chongqing during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but then also people who don't leave East China, but who are themselves displaced out of their homes by the Japanese occupation, or displaced sometimes a very short distance from one side of the Yangtze to another, for example. And then what happens when people come back after 1945? Almost immediately, they're launched into a civil war, which involves more displacement. And then we have the displacement of 1949 and the early Cold War period. This long process is something we really don't understand very well. We don't even have a grasp on the numbers. There's a sense that, between maybe 20 to 100 million people are displaced during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This is a very large gap. But that's something like a quarter of the population. If we count 100 million, that's a quarter of the population of China at that time. Compare, for example, just picking a 2008 number, there's obviously more recent figures, the floating population of China, which gets an enormous amount of attention now. In 2008, 140 million out of 1.3 billion. So, there's which is, it's an incredibly important topic, but we don't have a grasp on this, a sense of what displacement means in much larger sense during wartime. We don't even have even a guessing number for displacement during the Civil War, but that was also considerable, far beyond the 2 or 2.5 million that went to Taiwan with the nationalists. And there's also displacement of the dead during this time. 14 to 20 million people died during the Second Sino-Japanese War, most of them civilians. A lot of those people did not receive the burial in their home place, the burial in their ancestral land, particularly military dead, rank and file military dead. So how do we conceive of the displacement of the dead as well and the separation of the living from the dead? So these are some of the bigger questions that I'm asking here. So a few themes come through when we kind of add these different pieces together, and I'll give you a couple of them. One is the idea of settlement for refugees. What happens to the Dachinese when they come to Taiwan? They're placed on farms scattered throughout the island of Taiwan. This is funded by the U.S. State Department largely, and then also by the Republic of China government. And sometimes they're given handicrafts, but it's suggested that they farm. It's a failure. By and large, this experiment is a failure because Dachan is a fishing community. People have a really hard time on farms for various reasons. And of course, this causes further displacement of the local communities because land has to be given to people to settle, and sometimes it's not always clear that this is a quote-unquote unoccupied land. So there's a lot of conflicts, and sometimes you get this sense of a kind of triangulation that occurs between local Taiwanese and the first wave of so-called mainlanders and then the Dachanese. However, this is not an instance in isolation. We can see it as part of a larger pattern that develops around settlements for refugees. And I think this is a pattern that we see, especially in China. I don't think it's unique to China, though, and it's certainly worthy of discussion. The sort of conventional image of refugees tends, if you say refugee in your mind's eye, you may see people in camps, people in tents, people being given food aid. But there's another model, and that was very prominent in the early part of the 20th century, which is make refugees grow their own food, put refugees on farms, and not only can find a way for them to feed themselves, but in a wartime mobilization situation, find a way to use them. And that term was used during the Second Sino-Japanese War by a number of Chinese planners and intellectuals, use them to help feed the country, to help contribute to the wartime mobilization effort. So in my research on Chongqing, the nationalist capital, and in Sichuan, I found a number of plans, and I'd say about a dozen of them executed to house refugees, not necessarily rural refugees, but some of them were, on farming settlements in and around Chongqing and other parts of Sichuan. And it's partly crowd control, and it's partly economic productivity, but it's also partly an idea of state security, settling the border. Sichuan at this time was not well controlled by the nationalists before they went to Chongqing during the war. And so this was a way also of controlling a part of the country that was not well governed by the central state. And I think that this is a pattern that we can see also continued under the PRC, and people who work on the PRC would be able to say much more about that. And it's something that is so suggestive to people. And I think they also observing how the Japanese conducted their colonies in Manchuria, especially, and to some extent Korea and Taiwan. They may be observing what is going on in the Soviet Union and so on. That it continues during the Civil War. There's an idea that the refugees of the fighting between the nationalists and the communists in Jiangsu should be settled on farms as well. This, of course, causes a lot of conflicts with people who had lost property to the Japanese and wanted it back. But still, and this becomes an argument about nomenclature during this time. There's some people are called refugees, especially people who come from northern Jiangsu. Janet Chen has written about this, from northern Jiangsu to try to get land in and around Shanghai, but also in rural areas. And they said, no, we're not refugees. We're not these nanmin. We're not people who should be pitied. Call us righteous people, imin, because we were here fighting the Japanese when you guys left, when you fled to Sichuan. So we, give us something in return. So this idea of naming as well, naming the refugee, categorizing the refugee, as well as placing the refugee becomes important. For the Dachanese, they also have their issues with nomenclature. Dachanese are called by the nationalists as part of their propaganda effort, Yibao, this idea of righteous, Bao is a physical term, right? It's the same word that it's brothers, actual brothers and sisters, or it's the same term that comes up in twins and so on. So, like our brothers and sisters in arms. But I've heard from researchers who do oral history with the Dachanese that they said, well, we could be Yibao or we could be Yibao. We're like second class, like Jia and Yi, So they said, we're not really treated all that well. So, are we on the top of the heap or the second part of the heap? Because they found themselves displaced a second time by these settlement plans. So that's one aspect that keeps on going. Settlement, though, for me, as I do this research, I realize that settlement, it means more than just housing and economic production. It means moving culture, and to use a big unwieldy term, but it means moving ritual, it means moving family, it means moving religion. The Dachanese moved their temples with them by moving the deities or the incense. So they established, one of the ways they began to make their own way in Taiwanese society was by building their own temples. So that's a picture of the deities being moved. They also presented a challenge to the nationalist depiction of them through their grief, through their mourning, particularly the families who had contributed guerrilla fighters and lost guerrilla fighters. And this was evident even in the media depictions of them at the time. This is a cover of the Life magazine issue in early 1955 that talked about the Yijiangshan story, the Dachanese story, and that made manifest, didn't hide the grief of the widow of an Yijiangshan guerrilla. This was taken, I think, probably by Horace Bristol. There were two American photographers there at the time. And so another aspect that's become increasingly important to me is thinking about the displacement of the dead and the role that mourning ritual plays. And some of this came originally from a very famous short story by Zhu Tianxin, who was one of the first wave of writers, of so-called writers about mainland experience and life in the Zhuancun and the military compounds, where she talks about the problem of people who live, these mainlanders who live in Taiwan in the military compounds, not having any tombs to sweep on tomb sweeping day, and how weird they think that Taiwanese are with their tomb sweeping rituals, but also the fact that they just don't have any. And so she says this line that later became notorious, so a land where none of your relatives are buried cannot be called a home. That's the translation. The original, I think, the original is a little bit different than the translation, right? It's 原来没有亲人死去的土地, so it's even more personal, right? It's not just buried, but it's died, the land where people have died. So it's this separation from death and the amelioration of death through ritual as well as burial. But I think we can see all kinds of ways in which this is complicated. Part of the way that it's complicated by the Chinese is that the government, the nationalist government, particularly Chiang Kaishek, wanted to assume all the narrativization and, in a sense, all the glory and shame of the death of the Yijiangshan fighters. Ma Ying-jeou still has wanted to do this to this day in Taiwan, incidentally. But he was faced in the first memorial service for them. He was faced literally, in the case of this photo, with the families. And there's a very big contrast between Chiang Kai-shek, who, if you've seen pictures of Chiang Kai-shek, he usually doesn't look like this, not together, this slumped over and poor posture, and his face is, it's usually very composed. So, but there's a contrast between him, and in the back are the people, the sort of designated mourning assistants who are wearing New Life Movement uniforms and white flowers. But then you have the families who are wearing their local clothing, their local mourning clothing, which is very much not the designated Kuomintang way of observing military funerary ritual at that time. So the Chinese and the other Zhejiang Islanders present this ritual challenge as well as this emotional challenge at the time. And it's no mistake, I think, that the families are gradually written out of this commemorative ritual in subsequent years. You see them more and more on the side until they're kind of gone, and then they have their own ritual that is not so much part of the military commemoration. But in all the instances, all my cases, the problem of managing the dead, the displaced dead, the left behind dead, is an enormous problem for wartime refugees. And it cannot be easily taken care of by the government. And this is a place where local association, native place associations, or other kinds of groups continue to manifest themselves, continue to show themselves useful. So, for example, after the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, all those people who had been displaced to the interior of China, if they were still living, many of them had relatives who had died that they did not want to leave buried or leave back behind where they had died, but bring back to the home place, going back to this trope of home is where your ancestors are buried. So there was a tremendous movement for people who were able to do it, and an interesting wide swath of people across society managed to find money to do this, to send coffins back upriver on boats, wooden boats, even before living people made their way back sometimes, to the home place to be reburied after the war. They were sent through military zones, and so sometimes they needed permits. And this is a case of it's not just called a permit even, it's called a passport, a coffin transport passport, hujiao, that the government issued in order for these coffins to be sent. But that's the government, that's the permit side, but who actually sent these? These are native place associations who hired the workers at a premium because you have to pay more for people to transport the dead, to do the hard work of navigating rocky rivers to bring back these coffins. And so you can see on the other end, this is a native place association based in Wuxi and Jiangsu did a lot of this work. They were kind of acted as brokers for people who were not even Wuxi natives. And you can see this is part of a larger reconstruction, a moral reconstruction that's going on in the aftermath of the war. So this is a page from the local paper in 1946. And so the Native Place Association here has an ad saying that they're sending these boats with coffin shipments. But in the context, there's all kinds of other reconstruction going on. There's the Fishermen's Association to the left also reforming. There's also a temple reforming. There's all kinds of religious associations that are finding new space in the post-war, and they're putting themselves back together, or they're forming for the first time. There's also a tremendous movement to do new editions of genealogies in these few years, and rebuild tombs. So there's a counter narrative. Sometimes it intersects with the government narrative of nation and patriotism, but very often too it's a counter narrative of reestablishing local order by making sure the dead are buried and commemorated in genealogies or buried properly in tombs, and that those who are living have done the right thing by reestablishing place and order, and also by establishing these new socio-religious organizations which carry out a lot of the ritual labor that's associated with those actions. So there's sort of these two narratives, at least two narratives of sovereignty that are going on during this time period. So this is this kind of reconstruction, and there's words that are used about reconstruction and recovery of land that resonate in both those. So I should wrap up and allow some time for questions, and I'll do that by mentioning that one of the issues that this problem of continual warfare that creates, that the fact that the Second Sino-Japanese War is quickly succeeded by the Civil War, and then the Cold War in East Asia and is not really a Cold War, it's a hot war in many instances, is that there's a mobilization that never ends. Or when does it end? When is demobilization in China and Taiwan? I mean, we can think of, if we think of European history, and we think of Marshall Plan, or we think of American history and the history of the 1950s and economic reconstruction, we can think of a kind of moment of demobilization. Even Japanese history, with the occupation, we have a sort of firm picture of what that meant in terms of demobilization. But when does demobilization happen in these societies, in Chinese societies? I find myself quite hard-pressed to answer that question. So one of the things that I want to do is to really start to think about the long-term effects of politicized warfare. We might call it total warfare. We can argue about what total warfare means, but an easy way to call it is politicized warfare, where every citizen is mobilized in the act of war. And so what are the long-term effects of that? What does it mean to have continued mobilizations, linked displacements, and the experience of death? And I think a practical problem that raises is the applicability of memory work and memory and trauma for the China field. Why is it that there's been so little done on collective memory or the memory of war for China compared to Europe, for example, or even, I'd say compared to Europe? There could be a number of reasons, but I would venture to say that one of the reasons is sources, that people do not express and write about the wartime experience in the same way. And I don't think that means that they experienced it differently, but I think that we have to look at other things. We have to look at the ritual duty and the emotion and community expressed through that, for instance. We have to look at literature. I mean, literature has been actually the field where a lot of memory and trauma work has been done, but in terms of history, not so much. So we have to maybe ask other questions. And the last thing I'll end with is just a sort of plea to the room, which is about looking for the displaced and emplacing them in your work. So if we go back even further than my time period, so we go back to, say, the Taiping Rebellion or as the massive conflict of the 19th century, but I'm sure you can come up with other ones as well. So from that light, the history of China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and other Chinese societies in the past 150 years is a history of massive displacement, prompted by forced and state-incentivized migration, as well as by famine, disaster, and war. The displaced also includes the populations who make way for those on the move. It's important to remember. If we only count as a refugee, quote unquote, those who are officially designated as such by a state or non-state agency, I fear we are at risk of losing an important historical big picture, even though we do need specificity and detail. So please consider this a plea to look for the displaced in your materials, and consider this also an invitation to talk about it across time and space. Thank you so much. And we have a question. Good.
Right.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca, for a wonderful talk. I'd like an observation that I wonder what you would think of that. Because like when you were showing this picture of Chiang Kaishek standing slumped in a slump poster in front of the refugees from Dachau, I mean, it struck me that, I mean, I've seen similar pictures when they're commemorating the Yijiangshan battle where he does look anything but heroic. And I wonder if there's any evidence in the sources or any contextual evidence that Chiang Kai-shek mobilized this to portray himself as part of the refugees himself, because these islands are literally, you know, very close to his home county of Phang Hoa, on the mainland, and Chiang Kai-shek was extremely careful in sort of showing his deep roots in Shiko, his hometown. That's where he retreated during, when he failed in the Civil War, and also the rhetoric of not burying himself in Taiwan, but burying us in Zhejiang. And this, in a sense, literally was the last stand of that idea of being relevant in that province. So I wonder, was that utilized or in propaganda explicitly, or do you see any evidence that that was used implicitly in a way of sort of forging links between Chiang Kai-shek and, you know, this massive refugee population?
That's a really good question, and if there are people in the room who are more Chiang Kai-shek scholars than I am, please speak to this. My sense is that there is some discussion among people who work on sort of like the military strategy aspect of it, that, I mean, there's recognition that he was incredibly invested in this venture in Yijiangshan, against much evidence and arguing from a number of sides, from the U.S. side, from some of his own advisors, that this was a foolhardy military venture. And so that perhaps, I don't know if there's hard evidence, but there's perhaps circumstantial evidence that you know, there may have been this kind of local connection. The odd thing is, though, and I don't know, I'll have to think about it more, whether I mean, he's disconsolate is one of the things he is upon the failure of the military venture there, in very, very deep ways, because it affects a lot of things. So it changes the overall Kuomintang military strategy. For example, you see a big shift after 54, 55, in the idea of retaking the mainland and so on. But in terms of any kind of fellowship with the Dachanese, it really doesn't happen, in the sense that when the Dachanese come, the dialect they speak is not even the dialect that Chiang Kai-shek speaks, or, you know, in terms of language, and then also in terms of social standing, in terms of economic standing. The gulf between them and the Zhejiang people who are present in Taiwan, and especially who have power in the Kuomintang, the gulf becomes so apparent and is so wide that there's very little apparent ties. There's a lot of debate about the extent to which either these kind of local ties or the politicization of the Dachanese became an actual deep support, political support of the Dachinese for Chiang Kaishek personally or for the Kuomintang overall. I mean, there's an argument that, you know, the Dachinese were the hardest core supporters of the nationalists, but there's also some cases. A friend of mine told me early on in this project, and I later corroborated it with some other people, a story about Chiang Kai-shek's funeral. So Chiang Kai-shek's funeral, the narrative goes that the Dachinese show up and they set up altars and they cry the hardest of anybody. But then a friend of mine also pointed out, he said, well, I remember some women from Dachan showing up and crying, but they cried and they accused him. They say, you promised to bring us back, and now you've gone and died and you didn't do it. So crying takes many forms, and political affiliation takes many forms. So I think, we can give them some complexity. I'm sure that there were some people who allied themselves closely, but not everybody. Okay, Christian.
Two questions, a smaller and a larger one. One is about sort of looking for trauma in the sources. It seems to me that one important problem is that the political mobilization that you talk about is so thorough, right, and so and turned into a metaphor so strongly, right, that it's certainly in the PRC, right, the enemy is everywhere and struggle is everywhere, and so the conflict with, in Korea and the conflict with Taiwan is folded into that, and I would imagine makes it very difficult to see the kind of trauma that you are looking for, partly because, right, in both places, the state pretty much owns all the presses, right, so there's very private publishing. But the bigger question is in how far is this also a story about disease and sanitation, right? Because managing camps was very difficult, complicated, large groups of people moving around. So it seems that there's an aspect of disease and epidemic that is part of this story, and I wonder whether you've thought about this too.
Yeah, these are good questions. You're absolutely right about the problem of politics, the political narrative's effect on looking for trauma, and particularly for looking for personal experience. And an example I'll give is the problem of burial, wartime, especially burial during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So I've been looking a lot for sources about how people were buried in Japanese occupied areas. And of course, Wenshi Liao is the first place I think to look. But a lot of the accounts there have been shaped by the idea that some of the things that the narratives that Tim Brooks talks about in his collaboration book, the idea that resistance is valorized, and so that when people talk about performing burials in difficult circumstances, that they're often the people who are being buried are guerrillas who are fighting against the Japanese, and people are going at great lengths to bury these guerrilla fighters. So it's difficult to find these cases of narratives of people who died, for example, from epidemic or just everyday violence. So that led me to turn to look to the genealogies, because sometimes in the genealogies, especially in individual entombment inscriptions or in biographies, you can get some of that material. Sometimes it's shaped by the political narrative, but sometimes not. And so that's where I've ended up with that. The disease and epidemic, yes, and there's some very, very good dissertations and soon-to-be books being written about that bigger story. Nicole Barnes at Duke is working on that. Mary Brazelton, a PhD student at Yale, also. And the way it affects what I'm writing about is particularly in the case of this movement of bodies back after the war, because a lot of those people who are brought back and reburied are the kind of fortunate, what I call the fortunately known dead, or the fortunate dead, in that they're fortunate because they died of disease. Or sometimes they died in air raids. But in any case, if you died of disease, your body was, the location and the place and time of your death was known. As opposed to military deaths, which, unless you were, a high-ranking officer or someone who was deemed to be politically worthwhile, that was unknown, or you were buried on the spot. And so, in a way, this is kind of the, I hate to say that there's a positive side to disease and wartime disease, but in a way, the people who died of illness were the ones who had a chance of being repatriated in that sense. So that the infrastructure, the wartime infrastructure, public health infrastructure, contributed to that, I'd say. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for a great lecture.
Thanks.
You showed those passports for sending the lifeless bodies
Mhm.
to their home area.
Mhm.
Given the animosity between, let's say, Chiang Kaishek's government and the communist government, I'm a little surprised. There was no problem with the communist government accepting these bodies back to go to their locales. How did that work?
Yeah, well, this transport is happening in the immediate aftermath of the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it's happening it starts late 45 in 1946, 47. So there's not much of a problem about passing through. It's passing through militarily sensitive areas, but the Civil War has not really reached those areas. But of course, that problem, this is something I'm still in the midst of researching, is that kind of transport is no longer possible for families who have moved to Taiwan, relocated to Taiwan after 49. And also, there is a transport. It's not necessarily just involving these so-called mainlanders who have gone to Taiwan after 49. My understanding from some anthropologists is that there was actually a considerable reburial traffic for Taiwanese families who had who had originally migrated, maybe decades or even centuries before from Fujian, but who maintained burial plots back in Fujian. And so there was a cross-strait traffic in reburial. I mean, just like there's a trans-Pacific traffic in bones that people like Elizabeth Sin write about, people who came for the gold rush and then get reburied in southern China via Hong Kong. So there's a trans-strait traffic. And then that, of course, shuts off after 49. So for people, especially I think for people who are working in sociology, anthropology now, the interesting thing to think about is what are the attitudes of people in Taiwan to home place and burial in the past couple of generations. I think it's completely shifted. And people are not so concerned about, aside from the Jiang family, which is always going to be thinking about these various burial spots they have, not necessarily thinking about repatriating. Yes?
So your project seems tailor-made for oral history.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're interested in the felt of experience and so on.
Yeah.
But it's a little late, too.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So one question is, have oral histories, are they available at least to you?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is there anybody left to interview?
Yeah, there are not that many people left to interview, or if they were very young at the time. But there are some ones, I have access to ones that were done earlier that some of them have been published and some of them just kept. So, for example, the military-dependent communities, the Drensun in Taiwan, there are a number of oral histories of those that were done starting in the 80s or so. Basically, when urban renewal came to those communities and people were moved out of them, sociologists, but then also local government bodies in Taiwan started to interview those people. So that's a good set of resources for me, especially. There are some that have been done in Chongqing now, with particularly around the experience of bombing, and some people have been writing about that as well. So it is. There's a couple instances of some murder cases in Taiwan from '59 that I'm thinking about writing about I'm writing about them, but whether or not they're going to go in the book is remaining to be seen. And the reason I'm interested in them is this sort of an instance of what prolonged mobilization does to people, and the kind of networks that people use to survive, but also the problem of what do you do with all these soldiers in Taiwan and after they're no longer useful to the government. Some of them turn to crime, I'm sorry to say. But, no. Yes?
Maybe this follows along. I was just to ask about sources. You did mention that there were these interviews with John case. I wondered if they reveal anything about the politics of that moment. That is to say, how much was this voluntary and how much coerced? Apparently, some people did stay. At least one guy.
Yeah, I don't know. Yes.
Do you know the portions? And from the interviews, can one tell whether people were enthusiastically leaving Dachau because they wanted to avoid communist rule, or whether they were ambivalent about it, or even didn't want to go at all, but there was an army there that made them go. Did any of that become clear in your research as to what the politics of was at the time? They're called guerrillas. It's another question. It's relevant.
Right.
Well, guerrillas for whom? Guerrillas
Right.
are different colors.
Right. Yes.
Were these very enthusiastic KMT guerrillas during the war against Japan? Or were they possibly communists? Or was that whole thing made up about an important guerrilla base in Dachau?
Well, so essentially that area becomes, it really becomes militarized starting in, I want to say, basically 53, 54, so very shortly before that, the crisis. There's a buildup. And so the buildup includes the arrival of, well, first it starts with espionage. Then the espionage is followed by Kuomintang agents, which is followed by officials setting up a government, and then that's followed by Navy and ground troops and so on. So a lot of that is the existence of the guerrillas is a result of this political work that is done by the nationalists in very short order. And there's less information on the PRC side, but it's also clear there's military historians writing in China who have been very interested in the tactical aspect of this battle, who have been writing about mobilization on the Zhejiang coastal side too. So there's a kind of tit for tat going on there as well. So you have guerrillas of all stripes. You have nationalist guerrillas and communist guerrilla fighters. And they're drawing from the local people, and then they're also bringing in people from the mainland in China and the mainland Taiwan. But I think most people they don't have a very large stake in this. They have a large stake in not getting bombed, which is happening as the crisis develops, and so that's what drives people out. I don't know where they got that guy. Who was interviewed from the Red Cross, whether he was there or whether he was shipped in, or I'm not sure.
So there's no evidence of any serious resistance to this evacuation?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Yeah, Ben.
So you talked a little bit about the trauma and the difficulty of people from Dachau having to leave basically the tombs behind. Is there any sense of how that issue was resolved in Taiwan, or substitute tombs created, how practices might have developed?
I really want to know the answer to that question. I've been talking to people. Zhang Maogui at the Academia Sinica is kind of the dean of Dachau research lately, and so I asked him about this, and And he's done a lot of oral histories with Dachshund people and then their descendants. And he said he could not answer the question. So if he can't answer, I don't know who knows. But they were extremely active with their temples, and so we were sort of speculating that, well, I mean, one of the things might be it's just, well, maybe it's just not a very developed because of topography or local ritual systems or whatever it is. It was not very developed funerary culture, and that the temples were more important. But another explanation could be that the development of the temples was in substitution for performing grave sweeping ceremonies and funerary rituals and so on. Yeah. Yes. The temples are still around. The temples are still there. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Some of them were famous for having images of Chiang Kaishek in them, as well as images of the various deities. Some researchers pointed out that was also, among other things, that was a reflection of this battle for space, physical space and land that the Dachinese engaged in Taiwan, because often they had to basically just usurp land to build the temples. They couldn't buy it or get it directly. And a good way to prevent such a temple from being knocked down is to put a picture of Chiang Kaishek in it. So whether or not you're actually worshiping him is another story. Thank you. I appreciate it.